desktop set up here.
Oh, good. In the meantime, I can introduce you. So welcome everyone to our first Devfest event. Today, just to introduce myself, my name is Hussein. I'm a community co-lead here at Google Development Student Club in McMaster U. But today we have Lara with us. Lara is an Angular Google development expert, and she's going to be delivering a talk on Angular. She currently works at Cisco as a senior software engineering tech lead and leads enterprise level Angular applications. And again, yeah, she's here today to give a talk about some of the new features in Angular. So yeah, whenever you're ready, Lara, you can take it away.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I'll go ahead and share my screen and we'll put her in slideshow mode. Oh, good. I can move that over there. Perfect. All right. So as Hussein said, my name is Lara Newsom. I'm a senior software engineering technical lead from the customer experience team at Cisco. So we work on a very large enterprise Angular application. We use NX mono repos and NGRX state management. So that's kind of what my day-to-day looks like. My spare time, I'm a co-host on the Angular Plus show. I'm sort of inadvertently signed in as that account today, so that's why that's my screen name. I'm also an Angular GDE. I'm an NX champion and a Pluralsight author. So a little bit busy in my spare time. That's my GitHub there. If you would like to reach out to me after this for questions, LinkedIn is currently my social media platform of choice. So I'm Lara Newsom on LinkedIn. You can message me there. I do have a Twitter account, but I don't actually check it anymore. I am also on Threads, so you can find me there as well. So today we are here to talk about Angular. So what is Angular? Because some of you may not be familiar with it. So Angular is a JavaScript web framework. And so this is a web framework that's actually maintained by a dedicated team at Google. So they have they have a specific team that works on development of Angular, and they actually go around and we'll talk about it as well. What I like about Angular, it has built-in dependency injection, and it also has additional libraries to handle common tasks like routing and forms. So when I say web framework, it's kind of in the same space as something like React or Vue or Svelte or Solid. So all of those are web frameworks that we use to build applications that run in web browsers. So Angular at a glance, the original version was released in 2010, so it's been around for quite a while. It's been through one major metamorphosis. Version 1 to 2 was a pretty big leap. And then since version 2, they've kept all new versions as backward compatible as possible. Obviously, they go through code deprecation cycles if they need to. But Angular is great for large or small applications. You write the code in TypeScript. So that I came out of the .NET world. I was a C# developer. So writing in TypeScript really helped me out because I love my objects. And it's a very opinionated framework, which is what I enjoy about it for working with large teams. So my team is about 150 other developers. And since the framework itself is somewhat opinionated, it makes it a lot easier to make decisions because there's really only, there's some best practices for how to do that. As of November 8th, so last Wednesday, version 17 is the latest version of Angular. So if you haven't been around Angular much, you won't know that this is also a brand new logo. So as of November 6th, they released a new logo with a new docs site for modern Angular development. So in the last few releases of Angular, there's been quite a bit of change to just fundamentally how we're writing Angular code and how we're thinking about the code that we write. So the old docs are still live at angular.io. Those for version 17, that is still the official docs site, but as of version 17 for angular.dev, there's the beta docs site. When they release version 18 in the spring, these will be the default documentation for version 18 and above. So Angular releases new versions about every 6 months. They've stuck to that schedule for several years. So every new release is bringing us more and more new features. So Angular app dev, the new documentation, this is sort of the first big story. It's updated documentation. So they've gone through a lot of the angular.io documentation and updated it to be more modern, to reflect more modern patterns that we follow in Angular development. It's meant to have quick reference tutorials. So I think, oops, I'm going to go back a slide because I actually have a live link here. So in addition to all the docs, which this is a really great way to just kind of start learning about Angular, there's also tutorials. And so if we get into these tutorials, they come along with YouTube videos that are posted by the Angular team. So Mark Thompson is a developer on the Angular team at Google. And so he'll go through and walk you through the changes you need to make to build your first Angular application. You'll also notice there's a in-browser development platform. So you're able to actually write Angular code in the browser and see the changes right away. So you don't have to pull Angular down and get it started and running on your own machine. So it's a really great way to kind of learn how to do it without having to invest in pulling down all the packages and code that you need to get started with local development. All right, so back here, the new docs and the new logo, it's an improved learner journey. So one of the things that people have always criticized Angular for is that is a high barrier of entry. There's a lot you need to learn to be able to write Angular code. And so they've been lowering that barrier of entry with every release. And this new documentation is going to sort of represent that. There's a commitment to backward compatibility. We don't want to leave anyone who's been writing Angular code in the dust, right? So they want to make sure that everyone comes along. And these the exciting framework changes that are coming heralded a new era for Angular development, and that's why they went with the new logo and the new documentation. So you might be saying, what's new in Angular? I want to point out throughout the slides, I do have links here at the bottom. So this is a link to a blog post by Minko Gachev of the Angular team, where he goes through the new features one by one. But I'll do kind of a digestion of that for you here today. So what's new in Angular version 17? We've got a new control flow syntax. We've got deferrable views, signal reactive primitives, default standalone architecture, improved build process, hydration and server-side rendering, and some quality of life improvements. Now you may notice that the top two have an asterisk by them, indicating that those are still in developer preview. So what does developer preview mean? Well, it's a way for the Angular team to get the code out to us faster. So it's new features that are fully functional within the framework, but they may still have an open request for comments. They also may be subject to breaking changes. So for example, Angular just got signals in the library with version 16 in developer preview, and there was one method on the API that they decided to not continue with. So it was actually removed. So that would have technically been a breaking change, which is why that feature was still in developer preview. The alternative to that is stable release. So once something is in stable release, it's fully functional within the framework, the RFC period is closed, and it will conform to Angular deprecation and versioning standards moving forward. So as an engineer on an enterprise team, we usually only use code that is in stable release in our production code. We may do proof of concept branches or other types of things using developer preview, but stable release is kind of where we keep it for our enterprise production code. So the first new feature in Angular is the new control flow syntax. So this is really exciting. It basically uses block template syntax with declarative APIs, and this is to use in place of Angular structural directives. People entering Angular found the structural directives a little confusing to use, and I will show some examples of the actual code here in a minute. And then we can also use the new control flow syntax without actually importing any libraries. It's just built into the framework. So the new control flow syntax is, it's better for type checking. And it's a concept that exists primarily at build time. So It's a little faster, and we are seeing significant performance improvements with the new control flow syntax. So previously, we would use a structural directive. So here we're using the ngIf structural directive. In Angular, structural directives are indicated with an asterisk. And so basically what this is saying is if this expression evaluates as true, it will render this in the DOM. Otherwise, it will load this template into the DOM here. And so this syntax was a little confusing for people. And if we're using this in our code, we would have to actually import the ngIf structural directive. The new built-in statement looks more like this. So you can see this is a lot more like plain JavaScript. And so it's a little more intuitive for users. And the nice thing about this is it also gives us the opportunity to very easily include an else if block as well. So previous to this, if you wanted to do something was else if, we would end up having to do nested if statements inside these containers, which was really messy. And so I'm also linking to the documentation for these new conditional statements. The next one is switch statements. So we have ng-switch, which is another structural directive. So this is taking in this component property. So if the access level equals admin, it's going to render the admin dashboard. This is a little confusing. Oops, I tried to highlight it. So this block here. So if the admin dashboard satisfies the switch case for access level, it will render. Moderator will render if it satisfies that condition. Otherwise, it will render the default user dashboard. So this is a little bit difficult to understand. In the new built-in switch case statement, the syntax will look more like this, where we will still evaluate the property, have the case laid out here with curly braces, a little more like JavaScript itself. And then inside the curly braces, it'll say what element gets rendered to the page. Next, we have loop statements. So we would use ng-for to do that. So ng-for would essentially iterate over these divs. So for every user in the array, it will create a new page element. And now this doesn't look too terrible, but this is what the new syntax looks like. And what I really appreciate about this, I have another slide to talk about it, but is this track method here. Also this ability to put in an empty block. So the track function becomes mandatory. Before, when we used ngIf, you could use track by, but it was always a little confusing to implement and people would forget to do that. So the track function makes the Angular diffing algorithm for change detection run a lot more efficiently. And so now that that's mandatory, it improves the speed for rendering on the page. We also get that built-in empty block, so it's a little more clear when you don't have any data what you can expect. And it's using, under the hood, it's using a new diffing algorithm, which makes the runtime up to 90% faster. So that's a pretty cool improvement in speed. And then those benchmarks are here on this link. The next exciting feature we get is deferrable views. This is probably the one I'm the most excited for. So deferrable views essentially are allowing us to load specific parts of the template conditionally. So if you think about your website, you're not always going to, like, not every user is going to go to every part of the website. And so this deferrable view makes it easier for us to set up conditions for when the code for those pieces of the template should actually be pulled down and rendered. So let's look at how this looks in code. So basically, previous to this, if we wanted to lazily load code like that, we'd either have to set up a lazily loaded route, and that can be really tricky to get your routes in the right place, or we could use view templates to dynamically load components, which was okay. It was better than nothing, but it was still some confusing syntax. What we are seeing with the deferrable views, that it can actually improve initial page loads and your core web vitals. So your core web vitals are the metrics that are being used by search engines for search engine optimization and just general like usability of your website. So this is what the defer block looks like. This is an example with all of the pieces in place. So we've got the defer syntax here. In this case, we are passing in an expression that this isn't called an expression. I can't think of what it's called now. But when this is basically when this rolls into the viewport, it's going to render the feedback list. So that means this feedback list code doesn't get pulled down until it's in the viewport. While it's loading, it gives us the ability to provide a default loading block. If there's been an error, it allows us to provide an error. And it also allows us a slot to put in a placeholder. So what you can do is actually put in a placeholder of the code that looks exactly like what will be passed down from this without the actual data in it. So it's a way to sort of hold your space in your website so that when your actual code loads, it is seamless. So defer the default behavior when you have nothing in the parentheses here, it has no expression, right? So this is the default behavior. And if you put it in like this, basically when your browser becomes idle, it'll go pull that code down for you. So once your code is available, it will replace the placeholder content with the lazily loaded content. And then the one caveat here is that the lazily loaded content must be standalone. And so that is just a way to build component classes. We'll talk about that a little bit later in this talk. But you can use a standalone component that has module-based dependencies within it. If you have a trigger condition, so you can add on, and so on then specifies a trigger condition, and you can apply multiple triggers that will be applied as or conditions. So it would be on idle or on viewpoint or viewport, whatever. So whatever loads first is going to trigger the defer block. And then Angular maintains a list of available triggers. So we've got on idle, on viewport, on hover, on immediate, and on timer. In addition to that, we also get the when can take in an expression that it evaluates to a Boolean. So when the expression becomes truthy, the placeholder is swapped with the lazily loaded content. And then these when blocks can also be combined with ons as well in an or state. So deferrable views are really a game changer for improved application performance because you can really kind of pick out which parts of the app load and when they load and under what conditions they load. And it's really pretty unique in the JavaScript landscape. The next thing we get are signals. Signals were released in version 16 in developer preview, and part of the API is now available in stable release. So we get new reactive primitives, and this opens the possibility of fine-grained reactivity. So if you don't know what fine-grained reactivity is, essentially Angular, the current change detection model runs from the root of the application all the way down through all the child components on every change detection cycle. Well, signals are basically a primitive that have essentially a getter and a setter, and then they also track their consumers. So when there's a change to the value of the signal, it knows which parts of the application actually care about those changes, which in the future will allow us to reactively only change to the parts of the application that changed and only re-render those parts of the DOM. And there's also going to be future integration with some of the core Angular libraries, which I'm really excited about. So signals are not a new concept. If you've ever written an Excel spreadsheet, it's basically works like this, where the other cells that are listening to the value in one of these, you've chained these cells together, right? So we've got, we're making calculations based on the values of these cells. And when one of them changes, all of the cells update at the same time. This is essentially what signals is doing under the hood. And signals are actually represented throughout the JavaScript ecosystem. Angular is not the only JavaScript framework with the concept of signals, but it is new for Angular, so it's pretty exciting. Solid.js is probably the framework that relies the heaviest on signals. So if you're interested in learning more about those, that would be a good place to look. So the signals API, we get writable signals, computed signals, and effects. Now, effects remain in developer preview for version 17. There's a little more work they want to do on those. But let's first look at the writable signals. So to make a writable signal, we use the signal function that can create a new signal that can be read and updated directly. So this is how that looks. We will declare a variable to hold the signal. So we've declared a filter, and then we've used the signal function to create a new signal, and we're passing it in its default value. So its initial value is going to be better. It's not a default value, it's an initial value. So it'll be better. If I want to change the value, I can do that directly using the set function or the set method. So I've changed that to best. And if I want to read the value, I can just do that by invoking the signal. The next signal, we have our computed signals. So we use the computed function to create a signal that recalculates when the signals it uses are updated. So we declare it this way. So we declare a variable, and then we use the computed function, and then we actually pass in a callback function that is invoked anytime any of the signals that it is using change. So in this case, we have a count signal that this computed signal is relying on. So anytime count gets a new value, it will rerun this callback function, and the double value is going to be count times 2. And computed signals are read only. So the only way to change their value is to change the value of the signals they consume. And the final piece of the API is the effect function. So we use the effect function to create an operation that runs whenever one or more signal value changes. Now, this one is still in developer preview, but currently this is how it is working. So we basically use the effect function. We also pass it a callback function, and then anytime this count signal changes, it's going to console log this statement again. And you could put any code in here that needs to run anytime the signal changes. So for the future of signals, though, what we're expecting to see are signal components and inputs, and a deeper integration with Angular libraries like the router and forms. And overall, the goal here is to reach a fundamental change in Angular change detection, to move us away from the zone-based change detection that we currently have in Angular and move us towards more of a fine-grained reactivity. Like I said, signals open the door to zoneless change detection and improved reactivity. So that's why we're really excited about that. Another thing we get in version 17 is standalone architecture by default. So back in version 15, we got standalone components and stable release. So previous to this, there was a concept of Angular modules. Modules were very hard for people to understand. Essentially, they were sort of trying to provide all of the ingredients the component needed to render. The problem is it was a completely separate file, and it was really kind of confusing for people to understand how to chain those together. So in version 15, we got the concept of a standalone component. So all of the ingredients you need to render that class are inside the decorator of the class. And this will now become the default bootstrapping experience when using the CLI. So previous to standalone components, we used to bootstrap the Angular applications using an Angular module. So this now eliminates the need for the use of modules. However, it remains backward compatible with modules. So that's really great if you are ever on a team and you have module-based components, they work fine together with the standalone components. So this is just kind of what the bootstrapping looks like. This is the configuration file. So it provides all these functions that you can pass in to set up various parts. So in this case, this application would actually have the router module included. In addition, it'd have the HTTP client and the animations. And then this is what a standalone component looks like. So the only difference here between a regular module-based component and a standalone component is that the standalone component has this piece here. So standalone equals true, and it has an imports array. Otherwise, this imports array would be in a module, and then the module would have to declare the component and export the component. And so it gets a little bit complicated. So that's the piece of the puzzle they were trying to simplify for us. The nice thing is that Angular CLI provides a migration tool to standalone components. So if you're ever working somewhere and you have a bunch of module-based components that you would like to migrate to be standalone components, the Angular CLI provides a migration tool for that. Standalone architecture is one step in lowering the bar of entry to learning Angular. So this is probably the first step they really took to try to make it easier for people to learn Angular. The next thing we get in version 17 is an improved build process. So now, under the hood, by default, Angular is using Vite for local development builds. If you're not familiar with Vite, Vite's super fast. So that speeds up our local development, and then it's using ESBuild for production builds. This is the default application builder in version 17. And what they're seeing is it improves build speeds by up to 67% and reduces redundant builds. So previous to this, there would be several of the steps would get built over and over again. And now this is allowing the pipeline to reuse some of those build steps. And for most applications, it's just going to work. So if you're a dev working on an Angular application that's V17 or above, you probably won't even know that it's happening. But under the hood, that's what's happening when you run ng-serve or ng-build. There are some known issues with the build process, so specifically related to web workers, WASM importing, or rebuilds on Windows. And so they've sort of called those out. There's still work they will be doing on that. But if one of those situations affects an application that you're working on, you would just fall back to the previous build process. So updating the build process is currently manual, but we do expect that they'll create a CLI tool for that in the future. So the Angular CLI tool is fairly robust, and they do try to get migration and updates into the CLI as fast as they can. The next thing we get in version 17 is hydration and server-side rendering. So currently, Angular is a single-page application. So in a non-server-side rendered application, the server will send the HTML and the JavaScript to the browser, and then the browser does all of the rendering, which is still what happens in server-side rendering, but server-side rendering will sort of create an initial rendering of the application, so it speeds up the initial load of your page. So Angular Universal was a library that used to handle doing that. That is now brought into the Angular CLI as part of the repository, so that's really good news for people that use Angular Universal. And it's really easy to add hybrid rendering to an existing app with the CLI, so that's pretty exciting. And then if you pair it with ng optimized image, which is introduced version 15, maybe version 14. I can't quite know. I think it's 14. You can see an average reduction of 99% in cumulative layout shift, which is really important because cumulative layout shift can really affect your search engine rankings. If you have bad cumulative layout shift, that's when the page kind of jumps around as things load. So you want your page to be relatively static once on its initial load, because nobody likes it when things jump around. So Angular is also working with cloud providers for seamless SSR integration. And so they're working currently with Firebase. And so really it's just a couple lines of code to integrate Firebase with your SSR integration currently, and they're working with more for future releases. Server-side rendering can dramatically improve your application core web vitals. All right. The last thing I wanted to talk about are the developer quality of life improvements. So the Angular team recognizes that no one would use Angular if it wasn't fun to write Angular code. And so they like to include some quality of life improvements. So they've introduced a couple of new lifecycle hooks, which for most applications, they probably won't need to use those, but they're really good for loading third-party dependencies if you need to do that. What I'm really excited about are the dependency injection debugging in DevTools. So Chrome has its own DevTools. So Angular has its own Chrome DevTools. So if you open Chrome DevTools, there's an you can see Angular DevTools as well. And those will now provide information about dependency injection tree, which can be kind of complicated if it's been difficult to get at that information before. So now it's easily available through the DevTools. They've also included input value transforms. So components can have inputs that are passed into them. And now it's easy to transform those into Boolean values because a lot of times they come in as strings, and now we can easily transform those into Booleans. There's experimental view transition support. So if you route to a new page, there'll be some default animations that we can use, which is really exciting. And they simplified one of the component metadata, which is style and style URLs. We used to have to pass those in as an array, and they realized that was kind of crazy. And so now you can pass them in as an array or as a string. So if you don't write Angular every day, that probably doesn't matter to you, but to me, I find that really exciting. So developer quality of life means the tasks we do every day to write code just got easier. And so that's what I love about each release of Angular, is that they take the time to give me tools that make my job a little better every day. On the Angular roadmap, looking forward, they will be making some updates to Angular Material 3, including design tokens. So design tokens are where you can easily pass in a value, a tokenized value. So let's say you pass in a color, that makes it a lot easier to change it throughout the application. So, and they've also will be removing some of the deprecated components. We'll see deeper signals integration, signals inputs, view queries, and more. And they're also working on the testing story. So they're working with Web Test Runner and Jest to include those in the library. The future of Angular is bright. So this is a great time to be learning about Angular and to try it out. Speaking of learning Angular, I will shamelessly plug the Angular learning path on Pluralsight. I do have a routing course on Pluralsight for Angular. Pluralsight also does offer free weekends and sometimes even free months. And so it's a really great way to learn. Sometimes you can get subscriptions through employers or other I used to be able to, I think I got a free year of Pluralsight when I signed up for a Microsoft account. So there are ways to use Pluralsight for free. Otherwise, it is a paid platform. There's great tutorials on angular.dev. I will also shamelessly plug my podcast. So the Angular Plus Show podcast, we invite guests every week to talk about things that are Angular related, but also Angular adjacent. So we do talk about a lot of stuff in the JavaScript ecosystem, in like the web browser front end type world. And even we do get into, CI/CD pipelines and stuff like that as well. So I really enjoy hosting that every week, and I always learn something with every episode. And there's also a monthly Angular meetup that meets online. That's a really great place to get started in the Angular community. You can start to meet people that go to the meetup, but also they get world-class speakers at the meetups. So it's not like it's just a plain old meetup where, everybody's kind of sharing, first of all, you have the opportunity where you can present and share, but they also get people from all over the globe that are presenting at these Angular meetups. So it's really cool. And they do offer, there's a Spanish language meetup that meets monthly as well. So it's pretty rare to get really good content that is not in English. And so I really applaud them for being able to put that together as well. This is a link to the slide deck. I will leave this up for a moment. And that is the end of my talk for you today. So now if anyone would like to ask some questions, I'm here to do that because I totally just shot the fire hose at everybody and gave you a lot to
It's all good. Yeah, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much for that talk. Yeah. So yeah, just as she said, if anyone has any questions, feel free to unmute or just put them in the chat. Can hang around a little bit for questions.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it doesn't even have to be Angular related. You can ask me questions about Cisco. You can ask me questions about being a woman in tech. You can, whatever you want to ask about. So yeah. Or y'all can just like go get on with your day too, which is also fine. I'm sure everybody's had a pretty long day today. So
yeah. Doesn't seem like we have any questions.
Have I ever worked with React? I have worked with React. I worked on I used to contract for a grocery store. And so right before I joined Cisco, I worked on I they had like a relatively large React application, and they had a React Native application as well. I think the one thing I missed the most in React was dependency injection. The reason I like dependency injection in Angular is because it's very easy to get a singleton instance of a service, which means it's easy to hang on to state. So I can make a service in Angular that's injected in the root of the application. And then at that point, any class that uses that service as a dependency gets the same instance of that service. So I can actually keep stateful information inside of it. Now, React didn't really have that concept, so it was hard for me to go backwards from having that to not having that. But otherwise, I think I heard somebody say once, especially a few years ago, was always like, oh, React versus Angular. And it's really like, okay, so which one do you use? And, you're choosing from, right now, we're in a very lucky place. We're not choosing from a good platform, like a good framework and a bad framework. We're choosing from really good frameworks. And it's really a matter of what you're comfortable working in, what your team is comfortable working in, and really what's best for the job. Right. And so you could pretty much write most apps in any framework. It's really just a matter of, like I said, what your preferences, what your team preferences, what suits the project. And so making those decisions can often be as simple as like, like most of the team has written React before. And that's a valid reason to choose it. Or, for in our instance, the existing app that we were working was already in Angular, and all of the developers we've hired on my team at Cisco are specifically Angular developers. So it wouldn't make sense for us to change the framework at this point, because it's not like React is going to do something that Angular cannot do, and vice versa. So yeah, but I do encourage you to go out and just experiment with other, like if you're writing personal projects, go out and experiment with the other frameworks. I feel like I understand Angular better because I worked in React, because there are overlapping concepts. So yeah.
All right, we're just waiting for any more questions.
Yep. And you can literally ask me anything. Like there's no stupid question. So I know I always feel awkward asking questions in meetups because I'm like, oh no, they're going to know I don't know what I'm talking about. So.
I could think of a question. So you said you're currently working at Cisco.
Yes.
Is there anything specific you're doing right now with Angular that you want to maybe get into?
Sure. We're actually at a really interesting crossroads, because when I started at Cisco, we had a lot of it was legacy code. It was really only a few years old, but legacy code can be just a few years old. And so not only on the front end, but also the platform. So the APIs are also, and so we're at this interesting place where we're trying to get the front end code and the back end code working together better. And so we had a really exciting proposal today about sort of a rewriting of the platform code so that we can make the front end code more flexible and extensible. And so what I really have enjoyed doing at Cisco is really just trying to figure out, like when you start writing an application, it's easy to just kind of make these very one-off classes that can only do the one thing they do. And so I've been enjoying trying to figure out how to make an application that's easy to extend and change without having to go in and rewrite a bunch of code. Because ideally, we want to be able to roll new features out to our users faster. And the best way for us to do that is if we write an application that's super extensible and easy to develop in. So yeah, that's been really exciting. there's a question, do you have any resources for someone just starting out to Angular to learn the fundamentals? I highly recommend the angular.dev, their tutorials to start out with. And then what I do when I learn stuff, so a lot of times YouTube especially will suggest another video. And so a lot of times I kind of just go down the rabbit hole. I would also, if you're on any social media, Angular itself has accounts on social media. So like on LinkedIn, there's a large Angular community that's very active on LinkedIn. They're also very active on Twitter. I cannot go back. I just won't. And so, it's like you kind of got to draw your boundaries, but pretty much all of the platforms do have a presence for Angular developers. And really for anything you want to learn, I just recommend start with the framework, follow the framework, and then they'll start reposting people, follow those people. And, you start to build this network. You can always like unfollow or block people if you don't want them around. But it's a really good way to start kind of putting your finger on the pulse of what's happening in the technology and getting new resources. Like the Angular people on LinkedIn will post articles about Angular all the time. And it's great content. It's like articles, tutorials, videos, live streams, you name it. So there's no shortage of people in the community who are willing to help you learn. You just kind of got to get connected to the resources. So yeah. Great.
Okay, if there are no more questions, maybe we can give it one more minute just in case.
Yeah, no
typing,
problem.
but
And anyone, you're always welcome to reach out to me on LinkedIn, or Threads, or I have an account on Blue Sky, but I can't get I got kicked out. I got unsigned, like I needed to sign back in. I can't find my password. So I'm not as active over there, but I am on Threads. I am on LinkedIn. So yeah, you can always contact me and ask me a question there. I'm usually fairly approachable. Like I said, I'm not going to think any question is stupid. I started software engineering. I was 38 when I started writing software, and I taught myself how to write it. So I've asked all the dumb questions, and it turns out that very few of the questions I thought were really dumb were actually dumb. It's usually that it's really awkward for people to ask. So yeah, always feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to help out however I can. So
I appreciate it. Yeah, thank you very much.
awesome. Thank you for
I think
organizing.
we can end it here.
Yeah.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Awesome. And good luck with the rest of your events for the week. So
I appreciate that. Yeah, thank you.
all
All
right.
right. I'll see you later. Yeah.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.